Hello students, this is part 2 of this whole lecture on organizing, and I'm starting now on slide 18. The title of that slide is Delegation of Authority. So let's move to slide number 19. I'm going to share a little story with you from my family. I grew up on a farm in central Illinois, and I oftentimes heard my mother say, "Let Johnny carry the cabbage head, let Johnny carry the cabbage head." And I asked her one day, what are you talking about? What does this mean? So she relayed a story that happened to her when she was a child, and she grew up on a farm also. And apparently some cousins came to visit, and Grandma and the family went to the garden to get some produce out of Grandma's garden. And one of the children of the cousins was named Johnny. And Johnny wanted to help in the worst way. And his mother said, "Let Johnny carry the cabbage head. How else is he going to learn to work?" So in terms of delegation, I frequently go back to that little family story, because if we never delegate to people, how do we learn? If we're never delegated to, number one, or if we never delegate to those that we're working around, then how do they ever learn to work? How do they learn to do what is necessary and will promote their own growth? So delegation is both helping someone learn particular skills, learn how to operate within an organization. It also has to do, however, with their own personal growth. So delegation should truly be thought of from those terms, that it both helps people grow and it helps the organization get its work done. So looking at slide number 20, I really like this quote from General Norman Schwarzkopf. "Great leaders never tell people how to do their job. Great leaders tell people what to do and establish a framework within which it must be done. Then they let people on the front lines who know best figure out how to get it done." So unpacking this just a little bit, great leaders tell people what to do and establish a framework. So create the context within which the work is to be done, and then they let people who are actually on the front lines figure out best how to get it done. I would say many of our organizations could probably benefit by living a little bit closer to this quote from Norman Schwarzkopf. Looking at slide number 21, there are 3 essential parts to delegation. First is assignment, assigning the duties and defining the results expected by a manager to the immediate subordinates. So we first think about assignment, and I think sometimes we stop there, but let's go on and talk about authority. So authority is really granting permission to subordinates to make decisions and setting boundaries on those decision rights. It's very confusing if people don't know what they can make decisions about or where those boundaries are. On the other hand, it can be very empowering to know I can make decisions within this particular framework. And then finally, accountability. Creation of the obligation or the responsibility on the part of each subordinate to do the work that has been delegated to them. So 3 A's, I think I like this in terms of trying to keep in mind. Delegation is about assignment, giving authority, and then accountability. Well, let's look at slide number 22. And on this slide, I'm just laying out for you shared governance and shared management. I call it shared governance, shared management. And I'll tell you a little story again. It was probably in the early 90s that myself and other nursing leaders at St. Elizabeth were very interested in establishing a shared governance kind of structure. When you have knowledge workers, you want to be able to use their knowledge to the fullest extent. And I was pretty cognizant of the professionalism and how good the nurses at St. Elizabeth were, in my opinion at that time. So Tim Porter O'Grady is a nursing writer, leader, has been for years and years and years, and he and others, but particularly Tim Porter O'Grady, came across with the concept of shared governance. Well, I took it to Bob Lonick, my CEO, one day and said, I'd really like to try this structure. NICU was the first unit that seemed most appropriate to try it on. And Bob was not interested in shared governance because he believed that governance belongs at the board, and he was right about that. But he and I, in the course of the conversation, began to explore what it would look like to have shared management. And he readily agreed with me because he's a very participative kind of leader himself. And so once I began to describe it, and then he endorsed the concept, and I started, not I, but the whole nursing management structure, we started working on this. So we basically ended up with a professional nurse practice committee that actually I had organized that in 1988 when I started at St. Elizabeth, but then it was several years later that we really began to do shared management on a unit-by-unit basis. So we had 4 councils on each unit: management, practice, education, and quality. And you can see how those lay out. And the arrow at the bottom means that it's more of a horizontal structure. These different councils did not report to a head nurse. They oftentimes reported to a director, but they worked amongst themselves and across there was a lot of integration, in other words, between management, practice, education, and quality. That's what I'm trying to get across there. Well, let me move on because to slide number 23, because if we begin to talk about delegation, we also have to think about what are our strengths. To whom do you delegate what is the question. So here I have just provided some information about the Gallup strengths. I've used Gallup strengths for years, but one key component of a strength is, at work I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. A strength is built over a long period of time, but it's built by consistently using a particular strength. We all have strengths, but looking across the human spectrum, we all have different kinds of strengths. So research has shown that people who focus on their strengths are 6 times more likely to be engaged in their jobs. So that's always a question. When I was had responsibility, when I had people reporting to me, I always wanted to know if they were getting to use their strength. And you can go out to the Gallup website. In fact, I give you that Gallup website if you want to know what your Gallup strengths are. Research also showed that people who focus on their strengths are 3 times more likely to report having an excellent quality of life. So strengths extend well beyond the work environment. We use our strengths constantly. Strengths are our innate abilities. I'd like to think of them as our God-given talents. And if we get to use them in our jobs, we strengthen them, and I believe that helps strengthen all of life. A misguided maxim: you can be anything you want if you just try hard enough. Well, let me say I will never be a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals or the Kansas City Royals. I will never be a concert pianist. I don't have those kinds of strengths. I don't have those kinds of talents. On the other hand, I have different strengths and different talents. So do you. And it's really exciting to discover what your strengths are, what your personal strengths are, and also discover the strengths of those that you're working around or that you are supervising. And then a little formula that works very well is talent times investment equals strength. So I was talking about the God-given talent or those innate things. Well, once you discover what those are for yourself, and then you invest time and energy, you learn more about them, you don't just let them kind of sit on the shelf and stagnate. You use them, they become a strength. So I just wanted to share some of that information with you, particularly while we're talking about delegation. Let's move on to slide 24, recognition and reward. Once you begin to delegate, it's very, very important. It's critical, in fact, to incorporate recognition. So just a few guidelines and a few ideas that I pulled from various sources. Match the reward to the person. We frequently try to match the reward to the task, but it's better for us to match the reward to the person. does the person want, would they like to go for coffee with you? I mean, go down to the coffee cart and, share a cup of coffee, because just giving them your time is what's important. Or maybe there's a different reward for them. Maybe it's not your individual time. Maybe it's a handwritten note that they can now keep and, forever, if you will. Match the reward to the achievement also. I realize that's also part of these guidelines. So match the reward to the person, match the reward to the reward to the achievement. In other words, if they've done something really stupendous, maybe you bring them into a management meeting and you recognize them in front of not only their peers, but other managers or even the hierarchy of the organization. And then finally, be timely and be specific. Don't just say, hey, you're doing a good job. Even though that's okay, don't take that out of your language necessarily. But when someone has done something that is significant, be specific. However you recognize them, be specific. And then there's just a few, on the right-hand side of that slide, there's just a few ideas. There's a favorite book that I kept on my shelf always. It was 1,001 Ways to Reward Employees. I don't know if you can find that book, or you might have a copy of it yourself. It gives excellent examples. So let's move on now to Chapter 14, Process of Reorganization and Tools to Improve the Process. So looking at slide 26, you'll see I've just identified several ways that we get at this whole issue about reorganizing and tools to improve process. So there's Six Sigma and there's Lean Six Sigma. You can read about those. Quality improvement is something that all of our organizations have been engaged in for a long, long time, and we are seeing better quality care because of those efforts. And then finally, re-engineering. I won't tell you much about those, but because I'm concerned about my time here a little bit. But re-engineering was the old way of thinking about redesigning work processes. Let's move on to slide 27. Because I think our book, Dunn and Heyman, lays out a nice way to think about reorganization, re-engineering, Lean Six Sigma. So, DMAR might be the way to think about this. So first you design, so looking at a particular process. And here's some questions. What is the purpose of the process? Who's involved? What are the steps? Flow charts work wonderfully for this in this regard. Then you got to start measuring parts of the process. And then once you have some data pulled together, you have to assess and analyze. Don't just let data, again, sit, or don't assume that a whole team of people are drawing the same conclusions from the same data. Talk about it. Get involved with the data. Engage with the data, so to speak. Where are the redundancies? Where are extra steps? Where are inefficiencies? And then you work to improve. You outline what can be done to improve, both in terms of quality and efficiency. And finally, then you redesign. What steps are absolutely necessary? What needs to be designed into the process to make it better? Moving on to slide 28, I wanted to give you an introduction to the Pareto analysis, or the 80-20 principle. We oftentimes talk about this. A man by the name of Richard Cook wrote a book called the 80-20 principle. So here's the definition. There is an imbalance between causes and results, inputs and outputs, and effort and reward. So in other words, what we've learned over the years is that about 20% of the effort produces about 80% of the output. And we find this, it's an interesting phenomenon. It occurs, now it's never exactly 20% on one side and 80% on the other, but look around you, pay attention, just think about the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 analysis is precise, it's quantitative, it requires some investigation, provides facts, it's highly valuable. On the other hand, 80-20 thinking can be fuzzy, it can be more qualitative, requires thought, provides some insight, but also highly valuable. So I would just encourage you, maybe you find an article on the 80-20 principle. It is alive and well in all of our organizations. And over the years, over and over and over again, you find the 80-20 rule at work. For instance, 20% of the DRGs drive 80% of the revenue within an inpatient unit. Is another, we would find that over and over again, the strategy work that I did. Well, let's move on to slide number 29, because I want to talk with you before the end of this particular, end of part 2. I want to talk with you about Baldrige. I had the privilege of being a Baldrige examiner. That just meant that I got to read 2 different years. I was trained, and then I read through documents that hospitals submitted to earn and to be awarded the Baldrige Award in healthcare. And Baldrige Award, there's a Baldrige Award for healthcare, for basic manufacturing, and for education, is my understanding. So Baldrige looks at these 7 components: leadership, strategic planning, customer focus, measurement, analysis, knowledge, and management, workforce focus, operations focus, and results. And organizations, through the years, we've known that organizations that work through Baldrige, work through the Baldrige criteria and attempt to become a Baldrige hospital, these awards that people work for stand the test of time, and they are excellent. Slide 30 actually then lays out how we think about the Baldrige healthcare criteria for performance excellence framework. And we always talked about this as the Baldrige hamburger. So as you can see, there's those 7 components, starting with leadership, ending with results. But there's also an organizational profile in which the organization critically examines things like their environment, their relationships, strategic situations. And then number 4 at the bottom, so the bottom part of the hamburger, if you will, is the measurement analysis. And measurement impacts 1, 2, 3, impacts 5, 6, 7. The other thing this little graphic does for us is shows us that leadership, strategic planning, and customer focus, those kind of clump together, those fit together. And then workforce focus, operations focus, and results, those fit together. And they flow back and forth. It's not to say that leadership is needed throughout the organization. I don't like these simple little boxes, but the boxes help us define and say, well, leadership is critical, so is strategic planning, customer focus. Anyway, here in Nebraska, people who are interested in Baldrige may apply for the Edgerton Award, at least back in the day. I may be dating myself here, but back in the day, hospitals could apply for the Edgerton Award, would use the very same measurement criteria, but in order to prepare, or some of them were sometimes interested in moving on and being part of applying for the Baldrige Award, so they would go through the Edgerton process here in Nebraska. And finally, slide 31. What lies behind you and what lies in front of you pales in comparison to what lies inside you. That's a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So thank you for listening to these 2 parts of the lecture. Please take a few minutes, go find the Simon Sinek TED Talk about how to create a safe environment, and answer the questions on the discussion board. Thank you very much. Bye.